PC clock speeds kept going up and up and up, but all those extra gigahertz caused more and more power consumption, so at some point in the 2000s it just became so much harder to go faster, and ever since then basically power consumption and cooling has been a limiting factor for PC clock speeds. And so I was thinking, if I run a PC outside in the winter, will that cold air help the cooling and allow the PC to run faster? And so I took this Geekom IT13 and ran it outside at minus 10 degrees, and it was only a teeny tiny bit faster. But then I repeated this experiment with this Geekom A9 Max, and it was significantly faster in the cold. And this video is sponsored by Geekom, who makes mini PCs, including the A5 Pro, which I'll be talking more about later. And so I was thinking I should also try this at higher temperatures, because that might degrade performance, and maybe all the temperatures in between, and have a more controlled environment. So really what I need is some kind of environmental test chamber, but those are big and expensive. So I built myself a temperature controlled test chamber, and the computer to be tested goes here, and there's a space heater in here to raise the temperature, and that's turned on and off with one of these smart plugs, and next to that is another smart plug that turns this blower on, which blows cold air into here, so I can raise and lower the temperature in the box. And all this is controlled by a little Raspberry Pi computer that can read a temperature sensor, and also controls the smart plugs, and also records the power consumption of the computer being tested with a third smart plug. And the temperature sensor is right next to the computer right here, and there's also a circulation fan at the top of the box to make sure that the temperature is even throughout the box. Now, I had added some extra bits of cardboard around the walls of the box to help with the insulation, but even with the extra layers of cardboard, it wasn't enough insulation, because with the heater set to 400 watts, it took an awful lot of heating just to hit 40 degrees inside, and the cooling was also very limited in that I couldn't get that low. So I decided to just cover the whole thing with a blanket for extra insulation. Also a scarf around the cold air pipe so that doesn't warm up the air as it gets blown into the box. Got my Geekom A9 Max in the temperature chamber, and there's a script running on here waiting for my Raspberry Pi to tell it to recompress a video file over and over again and record the times. And this guy, the Raspberry Pi, is going to run the temperature test. So running the script, and the first thing that does is to lower the temperature to the lowest set point by turning on this blower to blow the cold air into the box. And it's ASCII graphing the temperature on the screen, showing when it's going to hit the first set point. And looking on here, the Geekom PC suddenly started using a bit more power. There's some kind of Windows housekeeping thing happening. It's an annoying distraction that Windows sometimes just does things on its own. So with the outside temperature right now, I'm having a hard time hitting that 5 degree set point, but it's now within tolerance. There, and it's just commandeered my PC to start running the tests. And now this guy is going, and it's recompressing the same video file over and over again. So first time took 4.3 seconds. Next time is a bit faster because I got it in cache, and it just keeps doing it. And we've progressed to the 10 degree temperature test, and we only need to turn on the cooler periodically to maintain that 10 degree temperature. And this is run for 4 minutes now, which is the duration of the test for each temperature, and we've now switched the heater back on. You can hear it, and the temperature is rising to the next level. So this actually reaches the new set point quite fast, but then I give it a bit more time just to make sure the temperature settles. And now we just told it to run the next test, and here we go. I didn't want to have to stand there watching the tests, so now I've got remote test app going to the Geekom A9, and I'm using a remote logging on the Raspberry Pi so I can watch the whole test proceed from my desk. And I'm also running a temperature monitoring utility, and we're just running the last test, which is 40 degrees. And I just finished that 40 degree test, and looking at it in infrared, it's looking pretty toasty underneath that blanket here. Oh yeah, that is pretty toasty warm in here. It's just beaming heat out of there. I was able to rerun that test on a colder day, so I was able to get down to 0 degrees. And here's the times for each of those temperatures doing the same file over and over again. And here's a plot of that. Each line plots the times that it took to process the video file, and the first time was fast, and then it got slower and slower, and eventually settled at something. So baseline should be about 20 degrees. That's a reasonable room temperature. That's this one here. And that is at about 4.6 seconds to process that file every time once it gets past the initial fast one where the CPU is still cool. But if we go down to 5 degrees, I can do it in 4 seconds. Going down to 0 degrees, that's the black line, isn't any better, so there's no point in going cooler than 5 degrees. And if we go up to 40 degrees, it takes 5.5 seconds. That's a fair bit slower than at 20 degrees. Now plotting the temperatures from the core temp utility, so this is the first test at 0 degrees, and then 5 degrees, 10, 15, all the way up to 40. And we can see for the first 2 tests, the core temperature approaches 90 degrees but doesn't hit it. But after that, it pretty much hits 90 degrees every time. So basically, that CPU regulates its temperature to 90 degrees. And if we look at the self-reported power usage from the CPU, it's pretty high, but then as we get to closer to 40 degrees, the power usage drops because basically it runs the CPU slower, so it draws less power, so it doesn't go above 90 degrees very much. And with every one of these tests, of course, it started a bit faster because the CPU and the heatsink were still cool, so it used more power and then dropped it to maintain that 90 or 91 degree temperature. And there are a little bit of oddities in the graph here. For instance, here Windows decided to do some background processing, which means those runs were actually a little bit slower, but I just didn't use those ones for averaging the steady state. And also for the very first run at the lowest temperature, that one was a bit slower because the file wasn't in memory yet. But beyond that, looks pretty good. Now if we take the steady state average time and flip that over to essentially give us performance, and we say 20 degrees is 100% performance, going down to 5 degrees, we get more than 15% extra speed, and if we go up to 40 degrees, we lose about 16% of speed. So that Ryzen 9 in the Geekom A9 basically runs as fast as it can safely can, which is a function of cooling, which in turn is a function of ambient temperature. But this Geekom A9 has a BIOS setting for the fan right now in normal mode, but I can also configure it to be silent or in performance mode. And performance mode just means running that fan harder so that it cools better, which allows the CPU to run faster. And with that fan running harder in performance mode, the processing times are indeed lower. So graphing that in terms of performance, the blue bars are from the previous run, and then in the purple one, say at 20 degrees, we get an extra 4% performance just from running the fan harder. At 15 degrees, it's actually a lot more than that, about 7%, although at 0 degrees, the regular fan speed was already adequate cooling, and at 40 degrees, it also has a little benefit because the fan was already running pretty hard in normal mode. Mind you, that difference is less dramatic than it looks here because I cut the bottom off of the graph, so we're just losing a few percent of performance here. But what if I could run that fan even harder? Well, I can't, but I can give it some assistance. So I've got this blower here, which is actually bigger than the Geekom A5 computer, although still smaller than the A9, and this thing runs hard. So it creates so much suction I can stick it to the bottom here, and its own suction holds it on there. So I could try to blow air in on both sides, but I figure it's easier to just suck it out the one port on the back where the exhaust air comes out. So I mounted the blower underneath here, and then this goes on here. And rather than trying to put this thing on the computer like this, it just makes more sense to put the computer upside down on here so it can suck air out the back. And even without this thing plugged in, there's lots of suction on here. So I'm just going to leave that fan running for the whole test run. And with that suction assist, times all went down except for the 35 degree run, which was actually slower than the 40 degree run, and that's because there was some Windows processor running. In fact, before this test even started, power consumption was a bit high, so something was going on. But it must have stopped right about here, so rather than rerun the whole thing, I just said those last 3 points are representative. And now plotting it in terms of performance, so the yellow is with suction assist, so at 20 degrees we get another 15% performance compared to fan regular mode. At cold temperatures, it didn't help much because cooling was already enough. At high temperatures, it helped a fair bit because we just got so much air through there. So that was with the A9. Let's do the same test with the A5 Pro, which is like a little mini-me of the A9. It's such a neat little computer, it actually fits in my pocket. And I'm not even connecting a monitor or a keyboard because I'm just doing everything by remote desktop. And looking at my times for the A5 Pro, I just don't see those same kind of temperature effects. First of all, I doubled the vertical time scale because The A5 Pro has got half as many cores as the A9 Max, so for video processing that makes it half as fast. And there's very little temperature effect for the speed here, and every run, the first run runs quite a bit faster, then it plateaus at a different level, and then after about a minute it goes to kind of a steady state level where it's consuming 15 watts in the core. The very first run at 5 degrees, I couldn't do 0 because it wasn't as cold. The very first run at 5 degrees took quite a bit longer before it got to this next level, and I realized afterwards if I had paused longer between tests, all of these would have slowed down at the similar later time. So all of these basically speed effects are a function of time, not so much temperature. Although averaging in here where it reaches a steady state, if I graph that, we do see a slight difference. So this is on the same vertical scale relative performance with 20 degrees being 100%. So if I blow up the vertical scale, now this whole graph is like plus minus 2%. We see at 5 degrees we are not even 1% faster, and when we get to 40 degrees we lose maybe 1.2% of speed, so very little temperature effect. And I repeated that test with suction assist, although unfortunately Windows background processing got in the way again, so some of these lines are kind of squiggly, but using the best times here, we're getting almost no effect from suction assist. So the yellow bar is with suction assist, the blue bar is without. So the suction assist buys us, in some cases, a % of performance. So if higher ambient temperatures don't slow it down, that means the CPU must run hotter when the ambient is higher. And looking at a graph of core temperature over all the tests, so this is the 5 degree test and this is the 40 degree test, the core is clearly warmer when the ambient is warmer, although looking at the scale here, this peak here is actually only 75 degrees Celsius, so considerably cooler than the A9 Max. And scrolling down to self-reported CPU power, we can see it always spikes at 25 watts briefly, then 20 watts for a minute, and then settles at 15. And just looking at this middle part here, this is a 25 degree test, so that initial spike lasts less than 10 seconds, next level is a minute, and then we're down to 15 watts. So I think their strategy is that the heatsink has some thermal inertia, so going at 25 watts for the first 8 seconds or so, the heatsink's not going to get hot during that time. And then the next minute or so at higher power, I think they assume that the heatsink has more inertia in terms of temperature than this one does, and certainly older style heatsinks with a big block of aluminum take much longer to warm up. But these modern heat pipe based heatsinks don't have that much thermal mass because it's just a heat pipe that goes to a bunch of aluminum fins, so it warms up a bit more than probably they anticipated when they designed the CPU. And looking at the temperature graph with suction assist, we see a much greater increase in temperature, mostly because we start out at steady state of 30 degrees fully loaded when the ambient is 5 degrees, and then when we get to 40 degrees with suction assist, we're peaking out at about 63 degrees, so considerably cooler. The thing is, using this A5 Pro, it hardly runs this fan at all. It's like I can never really hear the fan going because when it does run, it runs so slow. Although looking at my temperature graphs, clearly it does run it more when it's 40 degree ambient than when it's 5 degrees. And I also ran this test with my Geekom A5, which is almost the same as this one, but not as pretty a housing. With the Geekom IT13, I did see more of a temperature effect. So this is core temperatures for the Geekom IT13 with different settings. The red line here is BIOS set to performance mode, and when the ambient gets to 35 degrees, we're hitting 95 degrees on the core temperature, so definitely getting into danger territory here and solidly at 95, 96 at 40 ambient. If I turn on suction assist, that's the orange line, then it's still quite okay. Also, if I turn off performance mode, that's the blue line here, we're still below 90. And normal with suction assist, we're actually quite low, just a bit over 70. And looking at relative performance in terms of video processing, these bars are with performance mode on, and that buys us about 15%. And we don't really get into dangerous temperatures unless the ambient gets to 35 or 40 degrees, at which point thermal throttling does pull it back quite a lot. But for normal temperatures, we're not getting into any dangerous temperatures. The only reason not to use performance mode is the fan runs a lot and it gets loud. So I like how the Geekom A9 Max basically just cranks up the clock until it hits some kind of safe temperature limit. I wish my other computers could do that, although I'd prefer if they hit maybe something a bit lower, like maybe 80 degrees. And that sort of approach for the Geekom A5 Pro could probably get another 10-15% of video processing performance, but that's not what the A5 Pro is about. Because unless you're running AI locally, doing lots of video processing or gaming, you're rarely using more than 1 or 2 cores in the CPU at the same time. And if only 1 or 2 cores are used, PCs like the A5 Pro will already crank the clock way up, so the performance difference for web browsing or business applications is actually very small compared to the top-of-the-line PCs. So here's some single-core performance benchmarks I've been running, and I scaled all these so that my 2019 vintage Core i7 is 1, and the Geekom A9 Max on some of these is almost 1.4 times faster. And here's the A5 Pro. Not much difference there, and the A5 is 4% slower, and the A9 Max is about twice as fast as my 14-year-old computer. In fact, I wanted to edit this video on this A5 Pro, but because I kept picking it up and showing it in the video as a prop and also running tests on it, I used the A5 instead, which is almost identical to this one inside, except this one is 4% slower. And you know what? It's been plenty fast and snappy even doing video editing with Kdenlive. In fact, I just copied my video project onto the A9 Max and rendered both at the same time. And the A9 Max is faster, but not even twice as fast at rendering a Kdenlive video. Now, one big difference is this A5 Pro has got 16 gigs of memory versus 32 gigs for this one. But even for the video editing, this hasn't been a problem. And with RAM prices these days, you got to ask yourself, is it worth paying extra for 32 gigs when 16 gigs will do fine? Now, I should remind you this video is sponsored by Geekom, and there's some purchase links for the A5 Max in the description. But I have to say, I really like how these A5s run because they're just so efficient and quiet. It's almost like the performance for those things is effortless. Sure, they could be cranked up to run faster, but it's almost kind of like, there's no need to because they're fast enough already for business applications. It's like they're only a little bit behind the top of the line, so who cares?